Hello, my name is Allison Pohlmann, and I'll be talking about Fort Mount Valerian, which is located about half an hour outside of Paris in an area called Suresnes. This is relatively close to the central part of the city, which is something to keep in mind, as Fort Mount Valerian is a fortress meant to protect the inhabitants of the surrounding city and populated areas. So, for some historical context, Fort Mount Valerian was built in 1841 as a result of the Treaty of London, which was signed 2 years prior in 1839. The Treaty of London prompted the construction of the fortress due to the fact that France was left out of the treaty that involved a few of the other great powers of Europe at the time. So the idea was that it was merely a precaution and wasn't exactly needed at that relative time in an urgent sense. But looking at the matter through the lens of France, this was post-Napoleonic era in the mid-1800s. So France had been considered the powerhouse of Europe at this time and prior to this time, which leads to strengthening the military and the need to maintain political power in relationships with other European neighbors. So after the Treaty of London, the European power struggle felt a little turbulent for France at this time. So the fact that the treaty was signed without them came off as calculated, which prompted the building of the fortress, which would come to use years later. So the fortress wasn't needed for actual defense and military purposes until decades later. Fort Mount Valerian was used as a defense barrier during the Franco-Prussian War. To further explain the Franco-Prussian War and give context for why it was needed during that time, the war lasted for 6 months during 1870 and the beginning of 1871 between France and the German Confederation after the German states were taken over by Prussia, which left France feeling threatened for that same reason of needing that political security and having that dominance in Europe years prior and wanting to maintain that. So the series of events, of political events, made military combat justifiable for them. And even though Fort Mount Valerian was surrendered to the German Confederation during the war, it got a reputation for being one of the strongest fortresses that France maintained throughout the war. During the war, it was given up in order to secure food and supplies for the central part of the city. It was an exchange. Today, the major significance of Fort Mount Valerian comes from World War II. It is more recognized as a World War II monument. It became a place where hostages were held during the war after the Nazi occupation. This area was considered an occupied zone, and the system that the German army had was that every time that they were attacked, they would execute a number of hostages. So essentially, it turned into a significant execution site from September 1941 to October 1943. Prisoners were taken to this location from other sites by truck. Basically, they were imported from other places, making it a prominent place where lives were taken at the hands of the Nazis. During this time, there were over 1,000 recorded executions at Fort Mount Valerian, but the actual number is unknown. With the context that the fact that any time the Nazis were attacked, they would execute the hostages, it's feasible that well over 1,000 were killed at this site. And today, Fort Mount Valerian mainly stands as a memorial and a reminder of the Nazi regime's effect on the Jewish and oppressed populations during the time of the Holocaust and the Second World War. It stands as a World War II memorial. Despite the history of the Franco-Prussian War and the Treaty of London roots, the focus is to remember and respect the lives lost at the hands of the German government during its occupation of France. Within Fort Mount Valerian, there's a trail. It takes visitors along the same path that the hostages had walked before they were sent to their executions. We can also find chapel, which there's graffiti by the prisoners held there. And in 1960, General Charles de Gaulle recognized Fort Mount Valerian as a World War II monument and remembrance site during his time as president. So ever since then, it's been a place that people can visit to commemorate and respect the lives taken in France during a tragic time. Charles de Gaulle's importance in this matter comes from his elaborate history advocating for the nation of France. He fought in the First World War, where he actually served as a prisoner of war, and then after that he had very elite military ranking and status, and he ended up being a top military commander for France throughout World War II, and in 1958 he was elected president of the Republic. And then these are just the sources I used.